Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 378. Today is Sunday the 21st of June 2020. My name is Minter Dial and I'm your host for this podcast. This week's interview is with James Mulvany. James is a serial entrepreneur based in Manchester, UK, who founded Radio.co, Podcast.co, and most recently Matchmaker.fm, a site designed to match podcasters with guests. In this episode with James, you'll find out what is the state of podcasting today, how companies are using podcasts more and more, plumbing podcast data and the business models, and how best to grow your podcast, or how to get guest appearances on other podcasts. You'll find all the show notes on minterdial.com. Now for the interview. James Mulvany. Wow. It's always fun to have a true podcaster, enthusiast, aficionado, connoisseur, and a man of radio as well. So James, in your own words, how do you describe yourself?
I'm an entrepreneur that helps other brands, other entrepreneurs connect with their audiences using audio. That's really how I describe myself. So I have a few different businesses, all serving specifically the audio space, including podcast.co, radio.co, and matchmaker.fm.
How did you get into audio? Was there sort of some crazy moment where you're like, oh, this is cool?
Radio came first before podcasting. In my story, I was always listening to the radio growing up, whether that be, during the daytime in the car with my parents, or when I was, going to bed at night. Sometimes I'd have it on, and I was always really fascinated with it. I think it kind of brought a lot to me as a kid. I found it an entertaining medium. I like to listen to the DJs on air, and I think back in the day, there's stories of. Everyone's got these stories where they used to tape it or tape themselves and play it back, or, record your favorite radio shows on cassette. And, I'm probably sure I went through all of that. And I was also interested in becoming a DJ. I love music and kind of just merged the two together. And in the end, when I was sort of at the age of kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to do as a career, I was also building websites. So I had some experience using Photoshop and Dreamweaver. I ended up putting the two and two together. I didn't end up going down the career of traditional, becoming a radio presenter, but I used the sort of skills that I'd learned, in the industry and doing some work experience, and sort of my passion for technology to create a service which was supplying the industry instead of so kind of more behind the scenes technical stuff, and just kind of went from there.
Your story reminds me of those times when you'd hit record and play, and punch it down, and then you try to stop it just before and now Capital Radio.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's that's the thing. I think that was where the love for audio came from, and podcasting, I think, is an evolution of radio. It's something that's grown a lot over the last few years, and it's quite an exciting space to be involved with.
All right, so with podcast.co and your matchmaker, you obviously have a real insight into what's happening in podcasting. So from your vantage point, considering the types of clients and work you do, obviously from whatever you read as well, how do you gauge the state of podcasting today?
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of constant updates and insights and reports being released, which all clearly show that it's grown significantly over the past few years. From our perspective as a business, we're starting to work with more and more corporate kind of clients. So lots of brands who are sort of seeing it as another route to market, as another way of communicating with their audience. Recently, I did a presentation for NHS Digital because they're interested in using it as a tool for engaging with stakeholders, as an internal communications tool. And I think podcasting, specifically, if you look at a company, their organization the size of the NHS, very distributed, people working all up and down the UK, and indeed some people are based overseas as well. Podcasting is a really personal medium to keep people up to date on things that are happening. So there's various different ways that businesses, I think, are using podcasting now. But if you go back 5 years, I think very, very few businesses were even thinking about using podcasting at all.
It's very interesting what you're saying, because in business, I would see many companies thinking about things like internal communications through video as
Yep.
opposed to the interminable emails. And it's true that the audio, while live in some regards, because you still need to get the words out of your mouth as opposed to type them and correct and edit and copy paste. In audio, you don't have to deal with the look. You can really just focus on what you're saying.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with a guy the other day who has a production company that produces lots of internal podcasts for corporations and larger businesses. And he was saying to me that the good thing about podcasts from the perspective of getting employees or staff or stakeholders or shareholders or whatever engaged with it is that, you know, you're not throwing a camera in front of their face. A lot of people will immediately sort of seize up when they're put in front of a camera. They don't know what to say, or they sort of feel like, oh well, you know, the pressure's on. And if you're sat in a room with a couple of other people who you have meetings with on a regular basis anyway, and you stick a microphone in the middle, it's a lot less intimidating, and I think the conversation will sound a lot more natural. So as a result, the benefit to the listener is going to be greater because it's going to be kind of less force. So I think that's kind of one of the reasons why I think businesses should consider it.
During the pandemic, what happened to podcasting from your vantage point?
Well, it's interesting because we were talking about this the other day, Minter, weren't we? I think, interestingly, on radio.co, we've seen a huge increase in traffic. We've seen in peak times, we're getting about 3 times the amount of listeners coming through the network than we were, say, in January and February. Looking at the stats overall for across the board on podcast.co, they've sort of stayed about the same. We have seen more customers signing up over the past couple of months as well on both brands. You know, again, I think it's people have got perhaps more time on their hands. You know, obviously we're all still working from home. So, you know, you still have to focus on the business, but there's not that distraction of people coming up to you and asking questions. So I think it gives you time to focus on projects that perhaps will put sort of to the bottom of the pile beforehand. So maybe this is one of the reasons we're seeing more people signing up to podcast.co. You know, more businesses, more brands are thinking, right, okay, now is a good time to do this, because, you know, often it'll be the marketing manager who's heading it up. They'll have more time on their hands, and ultimately this is something that they can actually finally focus on. Also, you know, it's a fantastic way to keep in touch with everyone whilst you're all working remotely. And there's nothing to stop you recording podcasts remotely as well. Again, normally we have a couple of different studio operations. So we have one in London, we have one in Manchester. So we will normally send clients down to the studio to record. Obviously, at the moment, that's not possible. So we are, you know, encouraging people to do it remotely where possible.
For sure, I've seen a number of brands turning to any number of different digital outputs and platforms, and so podcasting is getting its space, but it's still not the first port of call. People are still thinking more things like social media and e-commerce and this other thing. Podcasting for some seems to be so foreign. What do you think the future holds for podcasting now? Are we going to continue to see the sort of strong growth we've seen?
I think we will, because, you know, 5 years ago, Apple was still the main player, I suppose, in the industry. You know, they were the go-to source for podcasts. Spotify have, in the last 2 years alone, hoovered up a huge section of the market. Google are finally sort of starting to take it seriously. Google have just recently launched their podcast manager dashboard, which gives podcasters more insights into, you know, who's listening through Google specifically. But I think Google have actually got a lot of power to actually change the industry. One of the main problems is still being able to discover podcasts. The experience is not the best. You know, often if you search for a podcast and you've already listened to them, well, it will still come up. So there's tons of improvements that could be made, I think, to these platforms to make podcasts more discoverable. But the key point here is these huge companies are investing significantly in the medium, which will only help, you know, increase the number of listeners who are tuning in, because it's making it more accessible to a wider number of people, and also, you know, just generally drive more revenue as a whole to the medium, because advertisers are going to take it more and more seriously as time progresses. And I think, you know, looking at the numbers of active podcasts on iTunes, or Apple Podcasts as it's now known, you know, the last sort of year, say, they've just announced they've hit 1 million podcasts. That number was only 600,000, I think, in February last year. So last year alone, they've nearly doubled the amount of podcasts they have. So it's growing at a huge rate right now.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about that is Spotify also announced 1 million
Mm.
active podcasts. The interesting question then becomes, what is active at some level? Because there is still a long tail where it can exist and still be found, but there is this notion of up to dateness or not.
Yeah, I think an active, I mean, it'd be interesting to know exactly what the definition is, but presumably is active, there's two ways of looking at an active podcast, isn't there? Is it that there's been an episode that's been published within, say the last month, or is it that people have been listening to those episodes within the last month, or a combination of the two? Because, there are a lot of podcasts which aren't getting much traction, but they're regularly updated. Likewise, there are podcasts that haven't been updated for a long time, but still seem to get lots of listeners.
Yeah, evergreen
You know,
content.
yeah, I mean that's kind of one of the benefits of it, really. I think specifically when you're creating your episodes, if you can create titles and descriptions that are actively getting searched for, you've got a chance of pulling in listeners.
Yeah, I've had a habit of introducing the date that I do it like a timestamp. There are
Yeah.
other people that come from the school of, get rid of the date,
Mm.
remove any risk that people will click away just because it's old.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think one of the things that I'm most excited about Google is they have got the sort of computing power and technology to not just look at the description and the title, but what is actually contained within the episode in terms of they turn your voice into AI transcription, so text. And then obviously their super powerful, super good search technology will be able to give that text context. So if someone's looking for a solution to a problem, as most people now are Googling for questions versus kind of keywords, in theory, they have that power to sort of start recommending podcasts which will answer that question using that process. So I think that will help with discoverability, and also it'll be great for the podcasting world as a whole.
One of the things that I've struggled with is understanding what's happening with my podcasts. The, so the data was very obscure, almost, irrelevant. Now what I've seen is basically all the major platforms have created dashboards in the background. But from my perspective, I feel like I kind of need to keep on going into each of them to understand what's going on. I don't have a one aggregated. I'm hosted on Buzzsprout. I don't
Yep.
feel like I have an aggregated understanding of everything that's going on, because there's stuff happening on Apple that's over there, there's stuff happening on Spotify that's over here, on podcast.co or wherever.
Yep.
It's all
Yep.
over the place, and you feel like you have to, if you really want to be granular, you really have to have some massive numbers everywhere in order to have it make sense.
I think so. And part of the problem as well is each of those outlets have different statistics. So they will show you different data, which kind of makes it hard to correlate as well. Because, the way it's presented isn't unified. It's kind of annoying as well because, for example, we have a partnership with Spotify at podcast.co, which basically allows us to retrieve data systematically from their API. Okay. Apple have not yet done that. So technically you can't scrape or pull any data from Apple because it would be against their terms and conditions. You have to rely on their user interface, which as a provider for us is really frustrating because we want to try and provide our customers with as detailed and accurate statistics as possible. We know it's important because ultimately when you're working with businesses, they want to measure their KPIs based on, how many people are engaged with it, how long people are listening for. So I think there's still a lot of work to do in terms of statistics in the podcasting world. Traditionally, it's just been looking at download numbers. Again, that's fine, but it's hard to actually see if someone's listened to that or consumed that piece of content versus they've just downloaded it.
And that'll be necessary for the business model. One of the
Mm.
things that has always, let's say, raised eyebrows is the word podcast. And it feels sort of ironic if Apple were to fall into the background for not having openness enough, and the world of podcasting, which was begat through the iPod.
Yeah.
Where do you think that word is going to have legs? I mean, I look at the store, I think it still exists, the Carphone Warehouse, and how outdated that thought is, and yet they still had it emblazoned on top. Is podcasting as a word term going to survive?
Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? I think it's kind of one of these weird terms that was unfortunately coined, and I think it's here to stay. However, I know what you mean. It doesn't necessarily. I mean, it really. We watch a YouTube clip and we call it a video, don't we? It's not really technically a video. A video is, an old-fashioned bit of tape, isn't it? So I'm not sure. I think it's just one of these words that probably will be here to stay. It's just the same as car phone warehouse, like you say.
It's hard to overcome when it's got to some
Yeah.
kind of critical mass. So in Matchmaker, where you put together interviewer and interviewee,
Yeah.
what was the inspiration for this? Why did you launch yourself into that?
So a lot of podcasts, I think it's something like 60% are based on interviews, like we're doing now, or having guests on board or collaboration. There seems to be lots of people, reaching out to me, asking me to be on their podcast. Likewise, I've done the same. And when we were launching podcast.co, we thought of this as initially as a good marketing funnel. So it was really just we had a couple of pages where people could opt in on the website. One was targeted towards guests looking to be interviewed on more podcasts, and one was targeted towards podcasters looking for guests. So we noticed we put those forms up on the site. We already had quite a lot of content, and we were getting some traction in the marketplace. And we found that these forms were getting a lot of responses, and people were really engaged. And they were completing the forms with quite some detail about themselves. So we thought, okay, well, rather than just treating this as a funnel, is there more to this? Is there something further that we could potentially do? And are we onto something here? So this was really the groundwork we did, which then caused the birth of Matchmaker. And podcast.co is a relatively young company. We launched about a year ago. We were in pre-launch for about a year before that, so we're only about 2 years old. And so it is really classed as a startup. And what we've been doing with Matchmaker is treating it sort of as a startup within a startup. So it has a sort of sub team working on the development, and we're sharing responsibility in sort of sales and marketing to kind of grow the platform. And we've had some great results. We've hit 3,000 users now in less than 3 months. The next phase will be to make it more open. So currently, to access and browse guests and podcasts, you have to be logged in. The next phase will be making it more of a sort of public directory, to further grow and allow people to share their profiles on social media, etc. But the feedback we've had since launch has been fantastic. We've had lots of people say to us they've made really valuable bookings, and they've had some really interesting conversations off the back of using the product, which has been very exciting from my perspective.
You call it a Tinder for podcasting.
Yeah.
And it makes me think that on one, let's say in Tinder, there often is a bigger demand for a certain supply.
Mm.
In Matchmaker, which is there an imbalance? And the more people saying I want to be on, or I need more.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's something we're conscious of, because obviously this was the challenge to begin with. Was firstly, we didn't want to make it as open as possible, because no one wants to sign up and just see it's a ghost town. So how do you get guests on board if there's no podcasts, and how do you get podcasters on board if there's no guests? So we had to be very careful to begin with that we initially just launched it to our customer base, and that seemed to kind of start the playing field quite level. Now, what's happened is, yes, there are more guests, but there's not too much of an imbalance. And I think that's probably good, because I think we want to give podcasters choice of who they want to interview, really. So I think there's always going to be slightly more guests than podcasters, but we are actively reaching out to both of those demographics to make sure that we're trying to keep it as balanced as possible.
Having not logged in yet, which I will do right after this recording, do you look at Gratings within that? Because I can imagine that for a podcaster, let's say there's a large number of guests, but are the guests good? And one route is, as we know, go listen to them on other podcasts if they've been on.
Yeah.
And then you make an assessment their voice is not fun or nice, or what they speak and how they speak is not appropriate. What about that?
Well, we are, it's still quite a new platform, so there's lots
Sure.
of innovations that we want to add, including being able to sort of record a clip. The way it currently works is you set a tagline, so it's kind of like an elevator pitch. I think it's the same number of characters as a tweet. So in 180 characters or whatever it is, tell us why we'd be great. 240. We'd be great for I'd be a great candidate, say, for your podcast, Minter. And the idea is, when you're browsing guests, you hover over them and you can see this kind of tagline. So you can make pretty quick decision on who sounds like they might be interesting. When you click onto their profile, then you can see more information. So they can embed links to their social profiles, or they can link to other podcasts they've been on, and obviously write a description of their skills. Obviously one of the things that we're struggling with is some people spend a lot of time and do a really great job of this, and really sort of sell, from lack of a better phrase, really sell themselves, saying, look, here's why I'm good, here's my area of expertise. And other people will just sort of write a, half a paragraph or something. So I think ultimately it's one of these platforms, you get in what you get out what you put in. So I always say to people who are signing up, if you sign up, you've got to try and be proactive on both sides of the, whatever side of the fence you sit on. And reach out to people. Don't just sort of sign up and just sort of sit there and hope for the best, because yes, you'll get some messages, but I think, if you're actually being proactive, thinking, right, which podcast do I think look really good, or what sort of guests do I really want? We've added lots of filtering tools to make it easy to try and refine people based on their area of expertise, language, location, all that kind of stuff. And as I say, as we kind of grow this platform out, we'll be further refining this and making it even more powerful.
Being an entrepreneur, and I love the fact that you said you're relatively young at 1 year old. Most companies would consider that very young, and of course you are still a startup. But with that mindset, business models for podcasting.
Yeah.
What advice or thoughts go through your mind with regard to turning it into a business?
It's a very good question, because I don't think, it's still in its infancy, in the sense that there isn't a guaranteed pathway to success, if that makes sense. I think different things will work differently for different individuals. Again, what do you want to get out of it? If you're a business and you're launching a podcast, you might not necessarily want to have sponsors, e.g. other businesses advertising on your podcast, but you might be using it as a lead generation tool. So you want to be tracking who is coming from the podcast in your funnel. If you're, say, just an individual and you're looking to quickly make money, I don't think podcasting is a good way to go, because you're in it for the long game. And there's podcasts like entrepreneuronfire.com. It's been around for a number of years, and I think he still publishes like his monthly revenue, and it's a lot of money. He makes 6 figures a month from his podcast. And as a result, I think a lot of people come into it thinking, oh yeah, I'll start a podcast and suddenly I'll be making $200,000 a month. Obviously that's not always the case. So I think the first piece of advice is, if you're going to start a podcast, you've got to be you've got to persevere and stick at it for a number of months, sometimes even a year, before you really start seeing results. And that's when you can start thinking, okay, how can I make some money from this? And we've seen all sorts of business models working. Sometimes it is just sponsorship. Other times it's using your audience to support you. So via services like Patreon, and providing them with exclusive content in return for, a small monthly payment. That model can work really, really well for some people.
Like Sam Harris.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the other thing is using the podcast as a sort of platform to sell products or services. So might be merchandise, it could be consulting, it could really be anything.
Sleep With Me has that, yeah. But you do need to find ways to do it in a way that's congruent with you as an individual host, and then with your audience.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that one of the things that I was really disappointed with, and I still am, in terms of, we were launching podcast.co. We had some conversations with various different companies that sort of supply spot advertising. And these companies have really been born from the sort of radio industry and sort of transferred their services to podcasting. And the amount of money you get per 1,000 is really small. And I can't see how it's viable. You need an extraordinary number of downloads per month to make any money using this sort of spot advertising. But then again, it's generic, and I suppose most of your audience isn't going to be super focused. But if you've, say, got 5,000 people downloading your podcast a month, it might not sound like a huge number, but if like 90% of those 5,000 people are, experts in, I don't know, whatever it might be, X subject, well, that immediately is a very, very focused and valuable audience to a potential sponsor.
Absolutely. And it's also, it seems that let's say the reigning best practice is to make sure the host is the one who's actually speaking the tag,
Yeah.
rather than have some sort of generic, thing that just sounds like a sales pitch.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think live reads is the term which is used when the host kind of pitches the product, seem to be effective. And there's some very promising statistics about how effective these are, because I think it's something like 70 or 75% of people are taking action on commercial messages in podcasting, I think, when they're done right, which is really promising. But as I say, you've got to just make sure what you're promoting is a good fit for your audience, or, the product or service which complements your podcast, is relevant.
At the same time, it's still quite a leap of faith to think that someone who's running while listening to a podcast is going to remember to go get that mattress when I come back. As opposed to reading it, click on it, seems a lot more easy that way versus, or like a television, you can't exactly, well, you can today with the internet, but in the old days when you had a television, go buy Palmolive. Well, you have to remember to buy Palmolive when you're in the shop the next day, because that's the way it was the old days.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because like Squarespace seemed to be the company that's really synonymous with podcasts, and they they appear on all sorts of podcasts. It doesn't seem to really be any specific like type of podcast they're on. I hear them on business podcasts. I've heard them on text focused stuff, or even like on health things. All sorts of podcasts I've listened to. I've heard Squarespace as a sponsor, but I'm guessing it must work for them, because otherwise, why would they keep doing it?
Absolutely. What about building your podcast audience? What tips do you have on that? And, after 2 years, you've done it, you've figured out how to make a good product, or at least, the quality of the sound and so on.
Yeah, I think the first thing is just start. A lot of people will think about starting a podcast for a long time, but don't actually take any action. You can't start building your audience. You're starting from nothing in most of the case, unless you've obviously got a pre-existing brand or marketing list that you can sort of start sending these out to. So starting soon rather than later is always a good tip. Secondly, don't just upload your episodes and hope for the best. You've got to try and be proactive and reach out to any communication you can put forward, whether that be via social media or email marketing on your existing website. It needs to be treated as a cross-channel campaign. The next tip is, don't just go it alone. I think having partners, collaborations can be really valuable. Like obviously right now I'm speaking to you on your podcast. When this episode goes live, I'll be pushing it out to my channels. So having guests on your show is a fantastic way to increase the exposure to a wider audience than you would necessarily have straight off the bat. And it's a very quick way of doing it as well. And also cross-purposing, so don't just treat your recording as a finished product. What else can you create from that? Well, you can transcribe it, turn it into potentially an article or a blog post or a newsletter. You can create video assets with the audio, which you can then use to share on social media, and also quote, taking out quotes which are prominent and you think kind of the juicy bits, the sound bites. Make sure that you're posting them on your social media channels, because although all those things will help drive traffic to your podcast and ultimately create that momentum that you want.
As you said at the beginning, it's sort of a question of what you put in, you get out, because that all takes extra finesse and thinking. Well, what was a juicy thought? Find it, cut it out, and then repurpose it, send it out, and all that takes extra time. Just to finish, you wanted to say something? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, I was going to say in terms of time, if it depends on your budget, but you don't always have to do everything yourself. You can outsource things quite often for not a lot of money, and again, it just depends on how much time you value your time. Because personally, even editing takes quite a long time sometimes. So the more stuff you can, if you've got a business or if you're an entrepreneur and you have some kind of budget to farm elements of that out, there's plenty of websites you can go and find freelancers. You can approach companies like ours, which have a production capacity, which will help you out. So, don't think that you have to go it alone.
Brilliant. Good words. James, last question. Your favorite podcast or favorite podcasts which turned James on?
So 3 that I have been listening to recently. There's a guy called Frank Kern, who's a great marketer. He has a podcast called Your Next Million, which is great. Some of his episodes sound awful, but the content's really good. I've always been a fan of Paul McKenna from the 90s, and he has a podcast where he interviews loads of celebrities, kind of to find out what makes them tick, how they kind of got where they were. That's great. And third one, maybe Masters of Scale. I've listened to that on and off for years, and it's always interesting.
Groovy. Well, I'll put all those, as you can imagine, in the show notes, James, with your oversight to make sure I get the right ones. And James, how can someone follow you, connect with you, or of course, if they're podcasters or podcast guest potentials, find more about what you're up to?
Well, if you go to jamesm.com/connect, that's the page with links to all of my social media profiles. That's jamesm.com/connect. And also check out podcast.co and matchmaker.fm.
Beautiful. Thanks for coming on the show, James. Looking forward to hanging out with you more.
Cheers, Minter. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks for having listened to this recording of the Minter Dialogue Show. You'll find the show notes and other blog posts on minterdial.com. If you enjoyed the show, please head over to iTunes to give a rating and review. And to finish, here's a song I wrote with Stephanie Singer, A Convinced Man.
A stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger. To feel free, trust is the reason. Still, I won't toe the line. I sit here passively, hope for your respect, anticipating the thrill of your intellect. Maybe I tell myself there's no use in me lying. I'm a convinced man, building an urge. I'm a convinced man, to live and die submerged. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, challenge my fate. I'm a convinced man, competition's innate. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. Despise revenges and struggle to see. Live for the challenge so life's not incomplete. What's wrong with challenge? I know soon we all die. I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger. To feel free, trust in my reason.